Hey there, lab experts. Welcome to the RoK Diagnostics podcast, the podcast where we discuss everything medical laboratory science in Africa and around the world. In this episode, we have an interview with Dan Scungio, aka Dan the Lab Safety Man, a man with over 25 years of experience in laboratory medicine. Started out as a medical technologist, was also a laboratory manager, and today is a lab safety officer. Recently, there has been a new WHO Laboratory Biological Safety Manual, the fourth edition. It's very different from the others, and so we thought, why not have an expert come to talk to us about that particular manual? So we'll talk a bit about that. We'll talk about the WHO Biosafety Manual. Without much further ado, let's talk MedLab. Hello, Dan. Thanks a lot for being here with us today. How are you?
Thank you so much. Good. How are you doing?
Doing fine, doing fine. So tell us a little bit about yourself before we begin.
Sure. Well, as you said, I started out working as a laboratory technologist in various labs across the United States. And I worked as a laboratory manager for about 11 years in a couple of different labs and sort of had my fill of that. And there was an opportunity to move into laboratory safety and for a system of hospitals. And so I moved into that role and have been doing that for 12 to 13 years now. And then along on the side, I also have a laboratory safety consulting business. Have done a lot of writing, publishing, speaking, teaching, auditing, whatever people ask me to come and do in their labs. That's what I do for them, help them with their lab safety programs.
All right, I see. And what made you go into lab safety?
When I was a laboratory manager at my last site, our hospital was integrated with a system, and they brought in a lab safety officer to see where we stood with our safety program. And so I learned from her about lab safety. And then when that position was vacant, I started to become interested in the role. And we had a speaker come to a local CLMA meeting. And it was Terry Jo Guile, who was around the country and the world as the safety lady. And I talked to her about the safety position. And then once I got the role, I started working with her. She was teaching me, mentoring me, and then she started looking for somebody to take her place when she was looking to retire. And so we talked a lot about safety. She realized we had the same voice for safety. We were able to see the same things and see things the same way. And so we started working together for a number of years. So I took over her newsletter and eventually took over her business. And she's sitting on the beach in Florida right now, enjoying retirement. And I'm now Dan the Lab Safety Man.
Oh, nice. So you essentially switched. Like she was there and then you just took over. You continued the work.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, it was
that's
nice.
really nice.
Good transition. Yeah.
So I was saying earlier that we want to talk a lot about the new WHO manual. I think it was postponed originally, right? I think I had heard about it already back in 2019, very briefly.
Yeah, so there were a lot of moving parts with the development of this document. They realized it needed some changes, and there were some delays with its release, just because of all the different parts that were involved. It's written a little bit differently. There are monographs that are part of it now, which are different than the straight chapter format that they've used in the past.
Yeah.
And so they have specific focuses, and so it just took a little bit longer, I think, to get ready to put out. But it's now released and ready for everybody to look at. It's a free resource. It's an excellent resource for people to use for lab safety.
I see. And how important are the WHO's guidelines to lab safety?
So what's nice about it, from my perspective, is they look at the practices as best practices. They don't just look at guidelines. You know, when you start to get into regulations, you might want to talk about OSHA over here, but that really only affects the United States. While there are some good safety regulations, they might not apply everywhere. And so I think the biosafety manual looks at biosafety best practices, which are good everywhere, no matter where you are. So that's a good focus. It's a good perspective.
So it's sort of like the basis on which extra could actually be built on.
Yes.
All right. Now, you talked about already some of the differences between the last edition and previous editions, but what are the main differences?
Yeah, so I don't know if you've talked about this or not, but the CDC also revised recently their BMBL. If you hadn't heard of that, the Biomedical and Biosafety Manual. So that's also a standard that's used throughout the world, and they just revised and published their latest edition, the sixth edition. And one of the changes in that document, which is similar to what the change in the World Health Organization document, is a bigger focus on risk management and risk assessment. So that's just, that's always the core of lab safety. The first thing you should be doing if you're walking into a laboratory and you're not certain what the dangers are, or if you're building a new laboratory, or if you establish a new test or a new process in the laboratory, the very first thing you should do is a risk assessment. What are the risks? What are the hazards in all of the steps in housing these reagents, in working with these chemicals, in getting rid of this waste? What are the risks involved to my staff?
Yeah.
And so that's what's nice about the WHO manual of this fourth edition, is a strong focus on risk assessments. And that's good. They also have broken down their topics into what they call subject-specific monographs. And so risk assessment's the first one. And there's a lot of detail in that about how to perform a risk assessment, what does that even look like for your laboratory, and you can tailor it for your specific laboratory. And so there are lots of other monographs as well we can talk about, but risk assessment is probably one of the biggest. I would say it's a stronger focus in this edition of the manual.
Okay, because I remember a while back reading through some of the older versions, and I always had the feeling that there was no way that some labs, for example, out here in Africa, some of the more remote labs, would actually be able to set their standards to actually reach what was asked in those previous editions. But the current one, I feel like it actually makes it much easier.
Yeah, and that's true. So I was asked to work on a couple of the monographs or review them for this document, and I would agree with your assessment. I think you'll also see that I was also working on the ISO documents for lab safety, which were revised, I think last year, maybe the year before. Same thing. I would say the same thing. It's easier for labs to follow through, because you really have to start with the basics of lab safety, and remember that not all labs are in the same place. So I'm a lab safety consultant. Labs hire me to come to their labs and take a look at them, and when I walk through and do an audit, they always ask me, well, how would you grade our lab? Are we a 1 or are we a 10? And every lab is different, and that's true in Africa. That's true throughout the world, right? Yeah. Every lab has its own safety culture and level where it's at. And so if you want to improve that, you'd use a guideline like this to make a difference in your lab, but it has to be possible, right? You have to start with the things that are doable when it comes to focusing on lab safety.
Yeah, that's very true, because here, in some cases, when some of the labs, some of the reasons they give for not actually trying to get into lab safety is the barrier to entry. So I think with this, it's going to be easier to teach them like the very basis, the very basics that they need, and then eventually they can build up on that if they want to get their ISO certification or anything extra.
Yep. Certainly, education is the most important thing. It's the place to start. And without that, you've got people working in these hazardous workplaces without realizing what the dangers are to them, to their family members. What can they take home from their job? What kind of exposures might they receive in the workplace?
Mm-hmm.
And you really have to start with education. And no matter where you are, or what your level of safety culture is in your laboratory, you do have to start there. And risk assessment really is that you're determining what the hazards are, but you're also informing all of the staff about those hazards, and that's really important.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to African labs, have you ever had to deal with any such labs in the past?
So indirectly, yeah. So through CLSI in the United States, but of course CLSI creates documents throughout the world, laboratory standards. They were working with the CDC a few years ago to create lab quality and safety standards for labs in Africa. In various places, certainly not the whole continent, but in different, they were creating standards for that. And so I worked on a team that did that work. I also, a little bit more recently, worked with a group through CLA, the Clinical Lab Management Association, and I think their program was called AIRS program, and they were creating quality and safety training programs that would eventually be put on computers, and these computers were going to be delivered to labs in Africa and other countries in places where they really don't have very good resources for that, because computers, is one of the resources that were lacking. So what was nice is they had a grant to get all of these computers for these laboratories, and it would already be loaded with all of these safety training programs.
Yeah. And for that particular program, was there any sort of feedback from the labs?
If there was, it didn't get to me. It may have gotten back to the organization that provided those, but I certainly didn't hear anything directly.
All right. And in labs, I'm assuming you must go very often to labs, check out what they have, what their facilities are like, what the people are like. What are some of the most common lab safety issues you tend to find? Like, what are some of the things you think labs should really work on?
It's a wide open question. There are a lot of issues. There are a lot of safety issues I see in laboratories. And of course, I work in a system of 12 hospitals with multiple laboratories, and I'm constantly working with issues with making sure people are using their PPE correctly. Things you wouldn't think you'd have to worry about that are the basics. Wearing a lab coat and gloves. And I don't deal with that a whole lot in my labs, but I see that a lot in other labs that I might inspect or be called in to do audits and whatnot. Wearing the proper shoes, cell phone use is a huge issue. It's a huge infection control issue, very common in laboratories. In fact, if you look on social media, you can see there are lots of different lab sites on social media, and you can see people posting videos of themselves. One of the latest things that really has aggravated me as a safety officer, I don't know if you've seen what's called the blood smear challenge. And so there are techs online who are trying to create the most beautiful blood smear. And so they're doing it. They're making slides in the lab and showing it on. And look at my beautiful blood smear. But most of them are not wearing gloves. Most of them are not wearing lab coats or face protection, eye protection. They're handling open blood samples, and they're just ignoring the basic safety elements that keep you safe in the laboratory. And in this age of a COVID-19 pandemic, where there could be virus particles, wherever, we've got open blood samples, we should be worrying about HIV and hepatitis, all of the bloodborne pathogens, and those basic safety guidelines are being ignored and posted online for everybody to see. It's just, I just can't. I'm aggravated at that as a lab safety professional. It flies in the face of everything I teach. And to top it all off, they're using their cell phones to take pictures and videos of themselves while they're doing it in the laboratory. So think of this. You're a mom, you work in a laboratory, and you're going to get on your cell phone, and then you're going to go home, and then your 2-year-old child wants to play a game on your cell phone that you've used in the laboratory. And so there's just so much potential danger there. So not focusing on PPE use and cell phone use are probably two of the biggest problems that I'm seeing these days, which is surprised about PPEs. That should be basic, that should be enforced. But in a lot of laboratories, we see that it's not.
Yeah. I actually heard about the Bloodfilm challenge, but actually I haven't seen it yet. So I haven't actually seen the videos. But what would be, according to you, the simplest, or let's say the most efficient way of ensuring that people actually follow those rules in the lab?
Yeah, so it really has to come from leadership. And the people in charge need to hold their staff accountable to doing the basics. And there are lots of ways to do that. You can't be an absentee leader. You have to be there. You have to be inside the laboratory looking at what the staff is doing. But, I work with many lab managers, and I can tell you some care about lab safety and others do not. So I also work with safety coaches who are maybe in charge of safety in their laboratory. They're the safety resource, but they're not necessarily a leader or a manager. And so I also work with them and teach them ways to affect lab safety in a positive way without being the manager. The manager doesn't always support lab safety, but if you care enough about it, you can make a difference in your laboratory without the manager's support. It's always better to have the manager's support. Managers should be supporting their lab safety program, but we know from experience that that's not always the case.
Yeah, it's true. It's not always the case. So I'm guessing the most egregious practice you've ever seen or witnessed in the lab would have to do with the challenge you're talking about earlier. Or was there anything else?
I don't know if that's the most egregious thing I've ever seen. I've seen people eat and drink in a laboratory. In my time, I've been doing this a while. I've seen people do things like mouth pipetting. That's pretty egregious. I saw somebody from a laboratory go to a drinking machine in a clean area, but they had a cut on their finger. And they went and used the drinking machine to dispense water onto their finger. And that was a cringeworthy moment for sure. I've seen lots of things that probably would surprise some people when it comes to safety violations. So but that comes with experience. I've been doing this for 12, 13 years. And I've seen a lot, but that experience also enables me to walk into a laboratory and be able to quickly assess the safety culture and help people figure out what they need to do to improve it. And I do that a lot. People call me to labs, have me come in, do a safety audit, and you can tell pretty quickly. I also work with CAP, the College of American Pathologists, to do lab inspections. And of course, I like to focus on safety. A lot of people will say, oh, it's inspection day. The inspectors are here. Let's do the right thing. Let's wear our PPE that we don't normally wear. But you can tell when staff are not comfortable doing that. You can tell when they can't find where the gloves are kept and things like that. So it's kind of hard to hide that. It's hard to hide a bad safety culture from an experienced safety professional. And so that's one of the things I do is go in and assess the safety culture and find ways to fix that.
So one last thing, in a smaller lab, let's say a lab that's interested in getting the new WHO Biosafety Manual, going through it, assuming there are some things in there that they would like to implement, how would you recommend them going through the document? Like, are there some parts that are most important that they need to focus on first, or just from beginning to end and then go through the whole thing?
So there's an old saying that I don't know that it'll translate well in other countries, and I would never eat an elephant, just so you know. But the saying is, how do you ask the question, how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one bite at a time. And some people might look at this document as a big elephant. How am I going to swallow all of this and do all of this? And if you're just at the beginning of your safety journey, you may feel that way, and you should not be overwhelmed by this. And this book is not tiny, but there's a lot of things in it, but you don't want to be overwhelmed by it. So just like you described, Robertson, one chapter, one monograph at a time, and start always with risk assessment. So that's exactly where you want to start. If you're building a new lab or if you're redesigning a lab, you can go to the lab design and maintenance section. But if you're not concerned about that piece right now, go on to the next section. What about biological safety cabinets? We're looking into buying one, or we have one. How do we use it and maintain it correctly? And if you're not sure, then go to that monograph or go to that section of the manual. Saying PPE, there's a whole section on PPE, which is important. Decontamination is where you want to start your focus. You could start at the end and work your way to the beginning if you want to, because maybe those chapters are more important to you and things you want to focus on first. But again, always start with the risk assessment and see where your risks lie. Once you determine where your risks are, your highest risks are, that's where you want to start with focusing on safety in your program.
Yeah. And when you talked about it being overwhelming, something that came to mind was like in a lab, what's according to you the best way of convincing people to adhere to laboratory safety? Because sometimes that's the most difficult thing, actually making them understand how important it is, especially if they're already used, if they already have certain habits that are ingrained. Sometimes it's very hard to come in and be able to tell them, don't do it this way, do it the other way.
Yeah, and so again, teaching people what the risks are is important. I usually say there are three things that motivate laboratorians to do the right thing when it comes to safety, and you have to know your people and you have to understand what motivates them. Sometimes the motivator for them is money. And so you could say to somebody, if you don't segregate your trash correctly, sharps here, biohazard trash here, regular trash here, chemical waste here, then we could get fined for doing it the wrong way. If there's a government agency that will do that, we could end up creating throwing away things into biohazard trash, which is more expensive to dispose of. So we're creating a lot of extra cost to our laboratory. And so we can't get new instruments. We're not going to get raises. We're not going to get the salary we want because we're spending too much money on this wasteful stuff that's not safe. Okay, so some people can be motivated that way. And you can also throw in the environment. People care about the environment enough. And if you tell them this waste is harmful to the environment, if you throw it out the wrong way, they might be motivated, right? Through money environment. That's sort of one category. The next category is people are motivated and understand what the consequences to themselves are. So and again, that's education. Explain the dangers. If you get exposed to this blood, if you get exposed to a needle in a sharps container because you put your hand in a sharps container, now it's an unknown source exposure. Now you don't know what disease you might get. You might have to be treated for a harmful disease, and the treatment is not pleasant either when it's known source exposure, right? So consequences, important to teach those. And then lastly, some people, unfortunately, are just motivated by punishment. If there's a threat to being written up or fired or something for not following the rules and regulations, unfortunately, some people are just motivated by that. But you've got to provide those motivators as a leader. You've got to provide information about those motivators, or the staff won't change.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks a lot for that. So, yeah, thanks a lot for actually being here and trying to answer these questions. I'm sure a lot of people will be able to learn from what you talked about today. Now, if someone wants to get in contact with you, how can they do that?
Right. So I am available to answer lab safety questions always. And so I get questions. I put them out. I put out the questions and answers in my monthly newsletter. And so you can always email me a question at info info at danthelabsafetyman.com.
All right.
So I'm always open, and there's a website you can go to. It's danthelabsafetyman.com is the website, and you can find, there's a phone number. If you need to call and ask a question, I'll be glad to answer that as well. And you can see all the other services I offer. And please feel free to sign up for my free monthly safety newsletter. It goes out to labs all everywhere. So great. Thank you. But again, if you or anybody else has any questions, I'm always happy to answer them. My goal in life is to make labs safer all across the world. I don't want injuries or exposures in labs, and there's no reason we should have them.
Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you so much.